Hi, welcome to SQL Recovery for the Unitrends System Administration course. By the end of this module, you'll be able to identify your recovery approach and options. You'll also be able to recover your entire SQL database. First, let's take a look at determining your approach for recovering SQL. As always, the first question we ask in all the other modules and starting here too is, where are the backups that you want to recover? In most cases, they're going to be on your local appliance. You're going to go right back there. Those catalogs, once again, are kept on the appliance, ready for recovery. It's pretty smooth. Now, you can also recover these from cold backup copies. Once again, the secret here is that you have to import the backup first to the local appliance. Then the normal local recovery shows up, but you have to filter in the backup catalogs on imported backups. You can also do hot backup copy recovery. That's right off your hot target. Those backup catalogs are kept ready for recovery on that offsite system. The secret here is, once again, you need to have hardware over there. So in this case, you need to have servers that have been either recovered through virtual snapshots or bare metal, running the agent, registered with SQL running, so we can restore the SQL databases. When we start to look at what type of recovery we need, once again, you can do a full differential or transactional recovery depending on what type of backups you're running. You're going to run either fulls with transactions or fulls with differentials in most cases. Very rarely do you run all three. Now, from a full, you can restore that to the same or different SQL server running our agent, as we just talked about. You can also rename these and restore them to an alternate path. It's pretty cool. That's what I'm going to show you in the demo, is how do you test your SQL recovery without affecting your production. You can do that really cool right from a full. Now, some exceptions for the system database, we're going to cover those later. And then if you're restoring to a different SQL server, it must be the same SQL version or higher. We can go up, we cannot go down. When we look at differential and transaction log recovery, they must be restored to the same Unitrends SQL Server asset. The same IP, the same registration, the same name, and the same instance. You can't change it. They can, however, be renamed and restored to an alternate path, so you can recover from a differential or a transaction log without affecting production. Now, with transaction log recovery, I'm going to show you this in the demo too. It's really cool. You can go right back to a specific point in time, down to the minute. So if someone comes to you from accounting and says, hey, we need the accounts receivable back to 9 o'clock this morning, you can take it right back to 9 o'clock, depending on when you ran your transactional backups. It's pretty cool. Now, granular item level recovery, recovering certain tables within databases, certain rows and records within databases, is not supported from the SQL Server agent backups. It's not supported at all. You have to restore it out to a different name and then use some sort of third-party tools or your SQL Studio to do that type of recovery. Right? We're talking about putting the entire databases back here with SQL. When we look at recovering a SQL backup, then, how it basically works is you're going to choose your point in time once again. So whether that's a full, transaction, differential, whether it's sitting off on cold storage and you import it back, you're going to go to those points in time that you've imported back as well too. Right, now, when you choose those points in time to recover it out to the agent, the second phase, right, the normal local recovery here, when you choose those recovery points, you're going to set up your options. You're going to say, do I want to go to the same server, same instance, different name, rename, all those different things you can do. When you submit this job, each part of the recovery chain is going to be restored as its own job. Very different from Exchange. So it's going to put the full back first, then the differential, and then the transaction logs. It does each job. You have to wait for all of these jobs to complete, and then it's done a full restore of the database. If you go to your SQL Studio, you'll see the database up and mounted and running, just like the production if you rename it. Or in the case of putting stuff back in DR mode, it would be up and running in production with the same name and everything. Maybe do a new path if you moved it. Now, for master databases only, you need to make sure you stop that server prior to restoring and restart it afterwards. So if you plan on restoring that master database, you need to stop the entire server prior to restoring it and then restart it right once again once you're done. There are a few special SQL database considerations we want to go over. All databases have to go to the same version or higher. We can never go backwards. If they're clustered, kind of similar to Exchange restores when we talked about that, if you're running Exchange too, it might ring a bell here. You must select that cluster node when you're restoring a SQL cluster backup. If restoring to that alternate location, you must make sure that that path is on a shared volume with that SQL instance as well too, or it will cause those restores to fail if it doesn't meet those criteria. If you put the master database back, you really only want to make sure you restore it to the original SQL instance and name. Don't put a master back to another totally different server. It must be restored individually. You can't put it in a group with a bunch of other databases. Once again, you have to stop the instance before you even do the restore, so you can't restore other databases when you do this restore. Those would fail. The model and MSDB databases only back to the original server and the same name. There's no real reason to put those on totally different servers. And you have to restore those individually, one at a time. And the SQL instance can be running in the case of putting those two back. So only the master, you have to stop that instance before you actually do the restore. Once again, make sure you restart it once you're done. Then you can do model MSDB. Then you usually do your other databases if you're restoring a complete server. A few additional notes about SQL recovery here. Once again, this is the entire database restore in a live state. So when the restore is done and completed, it's going to be an up and running online database running with whatever name and storage path you gave it. Your restore procedures, they may vary depending on what type of backup and database is recovered. We went over all those with you. So depending on what type of database and where you're putting it, they're going to change a little bit. So make sure you're paying attention to those and make sure you really pay attention to any prompts you get in the system. They're very important. If it says, hey, are you sure you want to overwrite this database? Make sure you say yes if you really mean to do that. Right? Even if you're going to a different path and you didn't change the name, it's going to overwrite the database and put it into a live state from that newest point. That's an often common mistake. You think you're moving it to a different location for a test, but you didn't rename it to the same server, same instance. It can goof some stuff up. Preparing for a SQL recovery, once again, you're going to identify that SQL backup or the imported point. You're going to bring it back to the appliance. You're going to go to that recovery point. You're going to kind of check the database size and the requirements of that database. You're going to find a SQL server that meets it, usually the same one. If you're restoring that master, you got to stop that instance. Very important that you guys know that. And then if you're recovering transaction logs, you're going to make sure you synchronize your date on your SQL server with your recovery server. Make sure those are in sync first before you do the recovery. If you're going to rename the path, the point in time, you're going to set all those options in there before you run that job. Once again, if you're restoring the master system database, you want to restart that SQL instance once you're all done. Then you can do your other databases. Just a couple of SQL recovery best practices in here. Make sure you're always following those Microsoft recommended best practices for SQL backup and recovery. No matter what application or what vendor tells you to use SQL for their application, you really want to make sure you're following the vendor and Microsoft SQL best practices. And if you're hosting anything on VMware or Hyper-V, make sure you're following that hypervisor's best practice for hosting as well too. If you're hosting SQL on VMware, there is a great demonstration of applicationware for SQL in the VMware recovery module and demonstration. And there are some caveats for running SQL on Hyper-V. Make sure you check out the SQL backup module for some of those caveats when running on Hyper-V. Next, we're going to watch the how-to video tutorial on recovery using SQL backups.